Hi, welcome to the second lecture on tissues. So we already did a lecture on the epithelial tissues and connective tissues, and now we're moving on to muscular, nervous tissue. We will also talk a little bit about tissue repair. So basically what happens if you get a boo-boo, what happens if you get hurt. Okay, so let's start with a rehash about what were the four primary tissue types. So remember, if you see the word primary, I'm looking for one of these four. So I just sort of mentioned them. Let's rehash them though. The first is epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. All of the specific types of tissues are going to fall into one of those four broader categories. On to muscle tissue. There are three muscle tissues. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. All three of those muscular tissues have the same general function, and that is to contract. What does it mean to contract? It means to shorten. So I really want you thinking about how their function of shortening creates the shapes that you're going to see in the muscle tissue. How does the structure relate to the function? For the different types, let's start with skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is called skeletal muscle tissue because it is connected to the skeleton. And so the skeletal muscle is what we think of as muscles, like your muscles. Generally, what we're actually thinking about is skeletal muscles. Those are the muscles that attach to the skeleton and move your body around. Right? So they're going to be moving around. And when you look through the microscope at skeletal muscles, this is what they look like. And we notice that they are really long cells. We're going to talk about why. And so when you look at this picture here, they do not look like the generic cell that we talked about in the second lecture at all. They're not just blob circles. They're long cylinders. And so here's one cell, here's another cell, and here's another cell. And another thing that makes them different from the generic cell is instead of having one big blobby nucleus in the middle, they actually are multi-nucleated, which just means that they have more than one nucleus, and that nucleus is not dab smack in the middle of the cell. Instead, it is pushed off to the side of the cell, and that's because there's a very highly modified cytoskeleton inside of the skeletal muscle that creates the shortening, that creates the contraction. Okay, so they're going to be just jam-packed with a bunch of cytoskeleton elements that we will talk about when we get to the muscular system. Okay, so we'll put a pin in that. So those muscle cells, also known as muscle fibers, they are very long cells, and they're all going to be organized and bundled parallel to each other. Why do you think that all of the muscle fibers are running the same direction? So think about what their job is. Their job is to attach to the skeleton and shorten the muscle fibers so that they create movement. When a muscle is moving the skeleton, it's only going to move it in one single direction. So we want all of those muscle fibers to be shortening in the same direction so that you get overall movement of the entire skeletal muscle, the whole organ. Right? If they're all in different directions, you wouldn't cover any distance change. Okay, so think about that way. So think about their function and how that relates to what you see in the picture. You see them all organized and all in the same parallel direction, and there's a purpose to that. It's to create one single direction of movement. Okay, so here's one cell. The other thing that I want you to notice is that skeletal muscle tissue has striations. And what striations means are these little stripes right here. They are striated. So let's talk about, well, where did those striations come from? Okay, so when we look at it, it has to do with that very highly specialized contraction cytoskeleton specialized for contraction, and inside of it you have a bunch of protein fibers, and they're all bundled and very, very highly organized into repeating units. Those repeating units are called sarcomeres. Okay, so here is one sarcomere, and you have a bunch of sarcomeres all repeating one right after another. And when they repeat one right after another, they're so very highly modified, highly organized, so that as they're repeating one right after another, so here's one, here's two, here's three, they also tend to stack on top of the sarcomere right underneath them. Okay, so this is how you get that coordinated contraction that allows the muscle to generate force. We will revisit this in a lot more detail when we talk about the skeletal muscle system. The muscular system later on. Okay, for now I want you to have a generalized idea that the striations come from the sarcomere repeating units, but we're going to come back to this. Okay, so for now, skeletal muscle is striated. When you look at it under the microscope, here's 1, 2, 3, 4 cells, and each of those cells have those little stripes on them. It is striated. Okay, on to cardiac muscle. What does cardiac mean? Cardiac means referring to the heart. Okay, so where do you think cardiac muscle is found? Only in the heart. It makes up the muscular walls of the heart, and its job is for those cardiac muscle fibers, the cells, to contract in order to create a squeezing motion that gets the blood moving through. Okay, so for now we're going to be focusing on the similarities and differences between the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, because when you are in the lab and you're trying to identify a tissue, you really want to think about, well, what is different between them, and that'll help zero in on what the answer is. Okay, so when we look at this picture right here, what is the same? What is the same, you can see, is that you still have those long cells, right? So we're not looking at little circle cells. You have these long cells, and they're also called muscle fibers. So there's long cells there. And but what's different? What's different is that instead of just being long cylinders, and that's kind of it, they instead are branching. So if you look carefully at this picture right here, here is the myocyte, which is another word for muscle cell. Here is the myocyte right there, and you'll notice that here's the long main piece of it, but it also has this little piece sticking up. It's branching, okay? And because it's branching like that, that's why they tend to look a little bit less kind of organized than skeletal muscle tissue. Because of the branching, makes it harder for them to kind of stack neatly on top of each other. Okay, so the shape of the cell is different. Okay, another thing that makes them the same is that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both striated. They tend to be a little bit less kind of distinct, but you can definitely see that striped texturing all throughout the cardiac muscle tissue. So it is striated. However, you'll notice that in addition to those lighter, kind of more faint lines that are lighter, you also have some dark lines, and that is a big difference. Those dark lines are called intercalated discs, and those are a very specialized type of gap junction, which just means a special way that the cells come together, and they are important for allowing one cell to communicate with its neighboring cells to help coordinate a contraction. We'll talk about that again when we get to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so for now, we know the similarities, long cells, striated, and the differences, difference in shape, so branching instead of just long cylinders, and the presence of those intercalated discs, the special gap junctions between the cells. And remember, the intercalated discs will be the more distinct, darker lines between the cells. Okay. Now there was a third type of muscle tissue. What was that? That is smooth muscle. So looking at this picture right here, why do you think it's called smooth muscle? What is definitely different between smooth muscle and the other two types of muscles that we just saw? What is it missing? It does not have any striations. See the texturing on this one and the texturing on that one? That's missing. So it's called smooth muscle because it is lacking those striations. Okay. So another thing that is different is that it has a little bit of a shorter cell, and those muscle fibers, instead of being like long tubes, they are what we call spindle shape, which just means that the fat in the middle and kind of taper off at the ends, but they are still rather long in comparison to what most cells in the body. So they're very long, but they have a long two tapered edges on each side, spindle shape. So for lab, when you are drawing your smooth muscle, I know that a lot of pictures make it very difficult to find and see the boundaries of the cells. I still want you to draw that spindle shape on the cells. I still want to see the edges of the cell, even though you don't really see them well in the pictures. Okay, so make sure I want to see the shapes of the cells because that's one of the main differences between the different muscle types. Okay, so where is smooth muscle found? So smooth muscle is involved in moving stuff, fluids and things like that around in the body, and they are located in the hollow organs. So things like your stomach here. So here would be the stomach, and the stomach has actually 3 different layers of smooth muscle, and its job is to move things through, but also to churn things around. The intestines as well. And it also, so things like the urinary tract has smooth muscle, blood vessels have smooth muscle, and smooth muscle in the blood vessels is to regulate the diameter of it to control blood flow. So those hollow organs, that's where you're going to find the smooth muscle. Okay, so 3 different types. We have cardiac muscle, moving bones. We have, skeletal muscle, moving bones, cardiac muscle, pumping the heart, and smooth muscle, moving things around in the hollow organ. Okay, so all of the skeletal muscle, tipping on my words today, sorry. All of the muscle tissue types that we just looked at, they are all very, very long. Okay, so yes, the smooth muscle is the shortest of them, but even that one is a fairly long cell compared to most cells in the body. So why? Why are all the muscle cells long? Okay, so think about that for a second. So what was the function of muscle cells? All the muscle tissues, their job is to contract, and contract just means shorten. Okay, so contract just means shorten. And so if you were like a circular cell down here, and your job was to contract, you wouldn't actually be able to go for very much distance. And if you can't go for very much distance, that means you're not going to generate much force for the overall contraction of the whole organ, right? So if you were really, really long, the longer you are, the more distance you can cover when you shorten. You can shorten a greater amount, and the more distance and difference you can create, the more force you're going to generate in that muscle. Okay, so they're specialized for their function of contraction, shortening. Okay, I'm going to stop it now. I'm going to go on to